Hello, I'm Sister Joanne Iannati from Wisdom House Retreat and Conference Center. Here at Wisdom House, I'm Art and Spirituality Coordinator. Anyone who has taken a world literature course certainly remembers the famous words from a poem that begins, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." These words were written by a poet by the name of Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Jesuit priest who in the 19th century found the fullness of God in both creation as well as in his own spiritual life. In fact, his particular poem that I just quoted, that particular poem has wonderful signs of the scientific world as well as the imagination, and all of this had an effect on his faith. A fellow Jesuit of his, a couple of centuries later, by the name of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, was also influenced by science, also influenced by nature, and the imagination that came from the interplay of both. Pierre was also a paleontologist, and in his work he literally unearthed the closeness of God by his contact with the earth, that he held in his hands. And as a result of that, his own spiritual life was enlivened by the very matter of our earth. At Wisdom House right now, we're fortunate to have Dr. Ursula King, a Teilhardian scholar. Dr. King is Professor Emeritus of Theology and Religious Studies and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Bristol. She lectures worldwide on Teilhard. The program she is presenting at Wisdom House right now is entitled Living in the Divine Milieu. She will now share with us some of Teilhard's vision of our God-filled world.
I'm delighted to be here at Wisdom House for the first time in my life, and I'm much looking forward to having a group of 60 or so participants to discuss and reflect on Teilhard de Chardin's insights and his particular love of all of creation. And this came about through his childhood, actually, of growing up in a volcanic part of France in the Auvergne, where he was encouraged by his father from a very young age onwards to collect stones and bones and fossils, and this first awakened his interest in what he later studied, much later, when he became a geologist. But he always loved to walk, to have his hands in touch with the earth and with nature. But he grew up in a very traditional Catholic milieu, and it was not only that his father interested him in the sciences, but his mother also got him very interested in the Christian mystics, and it's really these and the experience of nature all around him, which provided a particularly happy mixture for his background, which he developed later through his studies in a much more systematic manner. And he studied theology, he studied philosophy, and later on he studied the sciences. But he was always out on expeditions, all during his theological studies, collecting fossils, whether he was in France or in Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, or in Egypt, where he taught in a Jesuit college, or later on in Hastings in the south of England, where the French Jesuits had been sent because of the anti-clerical attitude of the French government. Now, what is very important is that Teilhard not only loved nature, loved it very deeply, but initially saw it in very traditional terms, except that when he was in Hastings as a theology student, very much towards the end of his studies, in 1911, you can exactly pinpoint the time, he discovered evolution, and it was a revolutionary discovery. As he said himself, it had an absolutely transformative, in fact a revolutionary effect on his thinking, on on his action and on his prayer life. Because what he discovered in nature, it was not just nature as traditionally conceived or described in theology or in any other books, but it was nature as it had been discovered since the 18th, 19th century in terms of its evolutionary unfolding, its creative process of becoming that had gone on for millions of years. And for him this was an awe-inspiring discovery, and he suddenly felt that all of nature was alive. And he describes this in very poetic and lyrical terms in his early writings. It was alive, and he sometimes describes it as if there was a presence, some universal being taking shape, which for him is the presence of the incarnate Christ, which he talks about Christic elements as if everything was permeated by some divine presence. And that for him was really a new way of looking at the world, at nature, and also at humanity in nature. And he felt really that we have to discover and we have to acknowledge and we have to live with the divine presence all around us. How the world, how nature, but also our action, our daily travails and troubles are permeated by a divine sense. And he speaks about this in his classic book of spirituality, The Divine Milieu. Now, what does he mean by that? The Divine Milieu, such a strange title initially. And it has been tried to translate it into English as a context or as the environment, but somehow it doesn't fit. So the English have retained, by and large, the divine milieu, the word milieu, and sometimes even le milieu divin. The early translations of the book carried the title le milieu divin. For Teilhard, it was a bringing together of the sense of divine presence in everything we do in the world to develop ourselves and the world and the whole earth together, but in a consciousness that this is really relating to the divine energies that are alive and active all throughout the universe, all throughout creations, everywhere in the world, everywhere on earth. So when he wrote in 1919, he wrote a very rapturous poem, The Spiritual Power of Matter, which some people thought was really much too pagan, almost too pantheistic. But he felt that in Christianity we hadn't really come alive to see this presence and nearness of God to ourselves, to all that we are doing. Now, I can't speak at great lengths about the Divine Milieu as a book, and I will do this during the weekend here, or during the day. I have written this biography of Teilhard, The Spirit of Fire, and this describes also the living in the divine milieu. It carries the word spirit of fire because he uses the fire as an image and symbolism all through his work. He felt really he was a spirit of fire. Following the fire, it meant following the vivid energies, the passion that makes us alive and that makes the world and all that is in it alive, and that we have to be beings of fire. We have to follow the road of fire. He says this from the beginning to the end of his life. It is the fire, and he speaks about the burning bush. He speaks about, the prophet, the chariot of fire in the Old Testament. He has the fire image. He finds the fire image in the Christian mystics. So it's a very important image for him, the spirit of fire that was alive until the end of his life. So it is really something very, very energizing. And having reread the passages in the Divine Milieu just in the last few weeks, I was very touched by the affirmation and the strength of his expression of how the universe is alive. The Face of the Earth is actually the title of a book, of a number of books, a series of 4 or 5, written by a Swiss geologist who felt that really the Earth is one from a geological point of view, because the whole evolutionary process affects the entire earth and all living beings on it. And Thea liked this expression because he felt, you know, we don't just live and experience countries or rivers or mountains, which we do experience, but he sees that the whole earth is one. He has this sense of the tremendous oneness of the earth. That's why he speaks about the face of the earth, the body of the earth as a planet, which we see today much more in terms of modern consciousness of the earth as one, and the planet that we have seen photographed from the moon, you know, the planet moving in space. This is a real novum in human history. Our forebears could never have this sense of what the earth really is and what we are as citizens of the earth, and how we all belong to one and the same planet, and how we need to form one community that embraces the earth, and how we are part of the community of life, which is, you know, all the other living beings, the animals, the plants. Everything is interconnected. So he had a very strong sense of this holistic vision. And in the Divine Milieu, to come back to the Divine Milieu now, and I will just say a few words about this book, he contemplated these themes in his mind for many years. And he first spoke about the mystical milieu before he even had formed the expression Divine Milieu, because he saw that, you know, there is something alive, and the whole of nature and the whole of our experiences connects us to God. There is a milieu there, which in the French sense of the word milieu is both a center, finding the essence, but it's also an environment. It's the ambiance, it's the conditions of our lives. And he said, during the First World War, when he was a stretcher bearer in the French forces and took part in 65 major battles, he experienced, you know, the presence of God and the sustaining presence of Christ in the most extraordinary and vivid manner, but he couldn't say Mass. So he started a meditation, a contemplation, when there was no way of saying Mass. And he repeated and expanded that practice when he was on his expeditions in Mongolia. And then he wrote after that the Mass on the World in 1923, after his first major expedition to China. Now, just to put very summarily here what happened, he was so convinced that evolution was right, but the Catholic Church at that time did not acknowledge evolution, and they were absolutely frightened how this would impact on the doctrine of the original sin and the beginning of Adam and Eve and the biblical stories. So they did not like, when he came back from the trenches and was appointed professor of geology at the Institut Catholique, he held his lectures in his enlightened way, speaking about evolution. And this was radical. You couldn't do this. And that's why they were, in the end, they made him sign certain, just like Master Eckhart in the Middle Ages was, sign these statements, you won't do this, that, and the other. And he really was in a major spiritual crisis, the greatest crisis of his life. And his friend said, maybe you should leave the order, the church, whatever. And he was asked to do this several times during his life, and he got into critical positions. He did sign in the end, but he tried to live with this dilemma, if you like. It was the biggest spiritual crisis. He went back to China, and China proved, if you like, a very convenient exile, a way of living in two different worlds. But what he did in 1926, you see, they had taken away his appointment, his professorial appointment, so he had no more teaching position. So he was at large, in China. So he sat down and he wrote the Divine Milieu in 6 months, from the fall of 1926 to March 1927. I think it was November or just before that he started. And he writes to his cousin, I am writing my book, what I've thought about for so long, how we divinize our life, what it means to live in the Divine Milieu. And the book, which is not primarily written for Christians, it's written for the waverers, the seekers. And he describes it as an essay in the interior life. So what it is really working through his own very, very considerable spiritual and personal difficulties and developing a theory and thoughts how he could help people to live their lives and be encouraged to divinize, that is to say, to transform everything they do and everything they suffer. And that is really what this book is about. And this is very encouraging for other people. And Teilhard was never allowed to publish it during his lifetime, but many, many hundreds, if not thousands of copies were stenciled and distributed, and people read them without this being officially printed. So it became known among a certain group of people, but it really only came into the open when it was printed after he had died. But it is a book to help develop a particular spiritual practice to divinize our activities and our passivities, and thereby help and advance the reign of God on earth, if you like. That's basically it.